Canada's coming to grips with some bombshell information. It has just been dropped that the level 4 virology lab, Canada's top-notch secure facility that deals with things like Ebola virus, was infiltrated by a member of the People's Liberation Army. Their scientist was ousted years ago, and now we're finding out that the report from CSIS in the RCMP was held up by the Trudeau government. What does this mean for us as a country? But what does it mean for us as veterans? I'm going to dive into this topic. Stay tuned for what's going on in the clown show we call Canada. All right, so what's all of this about? What is going on? Why is this an issue? 4 years ago, there was a really interesting news article where scientists were removed from, like physically removed from our level 4 virology lab, microbiology lab in Winnipeg, which has some of the nastiest viruses on the planet. And they study them. Things like Ebola are there, for instance. And this was not a huge story, but it seemed kind of interesting. Like, what's going on here? Why would you just remove scientists? The allegations were essentially that they were probably working for the Chinese, the People's Liberation Army. So in the article here, it's titled, Chinese researcher escorted from infectious disease lab amid RCMP investigation. Okay, that's interesting. Public Health Agency of Canada describes it as a possible policy breach. No risk to Canadian public, nothing to see here. Carry on with your day. This is the scientist here on the right. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce her name, but clearly that's a Chinese name. And just read the first part of the article. A researcher with ties to China was recently escorted out of the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg amid an RCMP investigation to what's been described as possible policy breach. Her husband, I think I can pronounce this, Keating Chang, and an unknown number of her students from China were removed from Canada's only level 4 lab on July 5th. CBC News has learned. Okay, well, that probably wasn't based on nothing. So they had possible Chinese links. Interesting. Well, you know, what's even more interesting is that this was right before, you guessed it, one of the largest, scariest pandemics in human history, where everybody lost their freaking minds. July 2019. First cases of COVID-19 really started peaking near the end of 2019. But if anybody were to mention anything about this story, like post on Twitter and say like, hey, this is suspicious, you were labeled a racist and told it was fake news, like you see here from the CBC. Online claims that Chinese scientists stole coronavirus from Winnipeg lab have no factual basis. The CBC News report was distorted to create conspiracy theories circulating online. Okay, now we're getting spicy here. And this is in January of 2020. The machine's just getting started. It's cool to look back because you can go back on all these articles and realize, oh, wait, they were part of the big lie. Were they not? I think so. So you can see here, there's other posts. Kyle Bass, I don't know who this guy is, but a husband and wife Chinese spy team were recently removed from level 4 infectious lab facility in Canada for sending pathogens to the Wuhan facility. The husband specialized in coronavirus research. Oh shit, fake news, not true. Well, I don't know about that. It's funny how quick they came out to label people as spreading fake news and also saying that they were racist. Did China steal coronavirus from Canada and weaponize it? That was in Zero Hedge. That's a pretty cool publication if you haven't read it. It's kind of out there, but it's got some pretty good articles, not going to lie. Okay, so that's the backstory. What's interesting today is if we look at the news, and now CBC, I wanted to keep it consistent. CBC has said scientists fired from Winnipeg disease lab intentionally worked to benefit China. CSIS report. Mic drop. Ba-doom. There we go. Documents say that Dr. I'm going to say Q decisions could have impacted public safety. But wait, they said there's No risk to public health here. Guys, don't worry. Nothing to see here. But as of today, yesterday, when this story dropped, oh my God, there is. And the tune has dramatically changed. So one of the scientists who was fired from Canada's top infectious disease laboratory intentionally shared scientific information with China, potentially putting people's health in jeopardy, says an assessment by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. The intelligence assessment was released late Wednesday afternoon by the federal government, along with hundreds of other documents about the mysterious dismissal of Dr. Q and her husband, Keating Chang. There we have it. The government was freaking lying. They were just straight up gangsters about it. So where do we go from here, right? Like, what are the next steps? Well, I'm going to share with you today's press conference from Pierre Poilievre and his team and their response to this insane information.
The cost, the crime, the corruption, and the cover-up. But now we know that he cannot protect our people or our country. We've just received these documents that Trudeau has been covering up for years. Documents related to a massive security breach at the Trudeau government's most sensitive laboratory, where the most dangerous viruses and pathogens are studied and handled. We have learned that the Trudeau government's head of pathogens was collaborating with members of Beijing's People's Liberation Army who are responsible for bioweapons and bioterrorism. We know now that a People's Liberation Army official was able to gain personal access, walk in the door, look at computers, and have access to all of our most important virological secrets. If you think any of this is hyperbole, read the report yourself. This is from government documents, the Trudeau government's own documents. It says here on page 142, Winnipeg lab scientist Dr. Chu, pathogens unit, the top person in that job, according to documents on page 242, quote, represents a serious and credible danger to the government of Canada as a whole, and in particular at facilities considered high security due to the potential for theft of dangerous materials attractive to terrorists and foreign entities that conduct espionage, damage the economic security of Canada, end quote. It states further.
I don't know. This is pretty big stuff. He goes on to read the report a little bit more in depth. I tried to find where the report is and tried to find the actual link, but I haven't found it just yet. But I'm sure it's going to make the rounds at some point. So I'll be sure to drop this in the description at some point. So what do you think about that, folks? This is pretty big news. This is dangerous stuff that these scientists are dealing with. They had top secret access. And they shared it with the Chinese because they were working with the Chinese. They were clearly spies. But the thing was, the government knew. They knew, and they didn't hold an inquiry. They didn't freak out and go, holy shit, we got to lock things down. They just kind of pretended it didn't happen and tried to hide it. Why would you go ahead and do that unless there was something even worse? Right? That's how conspiracies work. So I don't know what's going to come of this. I don't know what the next steps are. But it seems highly dubious. And it seems like there's tentacles that probably go into every country. And so this is going to be a very interesting story. I'm sure Americans are involved. I'm sure British are involved. There's got to be a whole web of lies. And now Canada is the domino that falls. So who knows? Who knows where this goes? I just want to point out something very interesting. To me, this is an insane crime, right? It doesn't matter if you're a government official or not. It doesn't matter if you're prime minister or not. There's got to be repercussions. There's got to be something that can be done because this can't happen again. And I'm going to point you in the direction of Jeffrey DeLille. Now, you probably have no idea who this is. Jeffrey DeLille was a Canadian Armed Forces officer. He's a naval officer. He's a former lieutenant, Canadian, in the Royal Canadian Navy. He passed sensitive information from top secret Stone Ghost intelligence sharing network to the Russian spy agency, the GRU. DeLille's actions have been described as exceptionally grave by Canada's Department of National Defense and severe and irreparable by the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. He was sentenced to 20 years in penitentiary minus time served by the chief judge on February 8th, 2013. He was dismissed with disgrace or dismissed with misconduct. This is the punishment you get for sharing state secrets in Canada. And I'm not disagreeing. I don't really have an opinion here. This is just fact. Okay. I'm sharing this for a reason. If this is what a military officer gets as punishment for sharing secrets with the Russians, well, what happens when you're complicit in letting secrets get shared with the Chinese? So if more comes out that this was a coordinated effort, because don't forget, Trudeau was in negotiations for a vaccine with the Chinese. I don't have the link to that, but that was a thing. That's in the news. Why would that have been something that he was keen on doing? Something stinks. Something is rotten in the state of Denmark. I can tell you that much. So with that being said, I think Canada's in the thick of it, man. We're hurting. We're hurting pretty bad. And specifically, stories like this affect me. That's why I'm doing a video. They affect me. And if you're a veteran and you're watching this and you're Canadian, they might affect you too. And there's some reasons why that's the case. And I've got some evidence to back it up. The name of the paper is The Role of Political Practices in Moral Injury, a study of Afghanistan veterans. It's by Tina Mendik, I think is how you pronounce her name. And she's Dutch. So I'll highlight a few things here. I'm going to read them out because I think they're relevant. Because ultimately, the big picture is, especially if you were deployed to a war that didn't make any sense, which was pretty much the war on terror. Afghanistan didn't really have a clear picture. If you're in this case here, they mentioned Srebrenica in Bosnia. They didn't have clear orders. Anytime you get deployed and it's not clear what the mission is and politicians are kind of pulling the strings, we're instruments of that government. So therefore, it affects us because we are instruments of the government. So therefore, even though we pretend we're not, we very much are. So from an excerpt here, since the military is an instrument of the state, it is crucial to expand the conceptual scope to include political processes, particularly for the fast-growing literature on moral injury, which refers to the emotional impact of perpetrating, witnessing, or falling victim to perceived wrongdoing. So we've got the definition here. All right, so carrying on with this. Soldiers fight for themselves and their buddies. Many are hardly concerned with the political questions surrounding the mission on which they are sent and little bothered by larger national debates over these missions. Studies worldwide have documented the prevalence of such political disengagement among soldiers. So when soldiers are asked questions pertaining to political decision-making, they say, as some did to the author of this article, that my job has got nothing to do with politics, or that politics don't matter to me because I am just an instrument of the state. And this is exactly how I felt before I deployed. I knew I had to shut that part of my brain off. Actually, I willingly didn't want to look at the political side of things. I was going to fight, kick ass, take names, and hopefully come back alive. I wanted to go to war. This was my only shot. So I couldn't get into the depths of the political debate. It would have ruined my morale. So I knew this before I jumped into the war. And a lot of soldiers do anyways in the first place. Like, I volunteered to go to war. There was a calling for me to do it. But I couldn't dissociate myself from it. And I was looking at my old journal entries from my time in Afghanistan. And near the end, man, I was sour, like super sour, because I couldn't reconcile the fact with the whole scope of what we were doing was just a whole big bloody waste of freaking time, effort, lives, you name it. So this is what this article is talking about here. And the reason why it's relevant to all these scandals right now is because you can't dissociate from it. We were part of the state. So therefore, if something is going wrong in the state, we feel that because we were instruments of it. So it feels like something is going wrong with us is a good way to look at it. That something is failing because we supported this thing. We were part of it. So therefore, if it's a complete gong show, well, then were we part of the problem? And that's why this is an important discussion. Carry on with the article. So the heading here is moral injury and its unaddressed political dimensions. While current models of PTSD are generally based on the assumption that trauma-related suffering is rooted in exposure to life threat and thus in fear responses, the nascent concept of moral injury focuses on emotional damage resulting from perpetrating, witnessing, or falling victim to perceived moral transgressions. That is, while PTSD is about acts that violate one's sense of safety, moral injury concerns acts that violate one's sense of morality and ethics. Oof, that's deep. As such, the current concept of moral injury keeps the emphasis on the individual soldier and his or her actions and away from the political and military leaders who ordered them into combat and the civilians willingly or not who stand behind them. Okay, so this is super important. The individual, right, is really emphasized, especially when it comes to healing and coming back, right? It's you have PTSD, you saw things, you did things, but the context around it is never asked. I've never been asked about my shrink, like, hey, well, how are the actions of your government affecting you? How are the actions of the military that you served 15 years in affecting you? How is that part of your whole moral injury? It's never asked, right? It's never part of the equation. It's the incidents, address them. Okay, you're better. But it's bigger than that. And that's why I like this study. Various studies have argued a medical approach tends to frame human suffering as a condition contained within the individual. Consequently, it fails to account for the wider context of suffering. That's exactly what I just said. Moreover, it gives suffering individuals the status of a patient. In response, a large corpus of studies have emerged on what has been dubbed social suffering, okay, which examines the many ways in which political, economic, and cultural forces can produce distress. This is providing distress. The ArriveCan, the D&D employee, the ding-dongs that are running our government that have zero idea what they're doing, or maybe they do and they're just evil motherfuckers. I don't know. But from what I can see, it's a big clown show and the circus is not coming to an end. Carrying on. And this is the last part of the article I want to highlight here. Considering the veterans' experiences in relation to these political issues makes it possible to better comprehend their responses. Being confronted with political failure and intentional silence, veterans developed the sense that they were part of a puppet show. I'll call it a circus. This feeling, which Lifton is one of the researchers, has aptly called the experience of a counterfeit universe in his work on Vietnam veterans, indicates both a sense of political artificiality and the experience that this artificiality is denied by the political domain. Notably, veterans, both with and without deployment-related problems, use the term puppet show, presumably because political practices had not adversely affected them. For veterans wrestling with their deployment experience, however, the sense of being part of a political puppet show often became a vital issue. For them, it meant an inability to find meaning and justification beyond the direct experience of injustice and a sense that they were being used and abandoned while it all was denied. Oof. It's a big one to digest. Going to take a minute on that one. As a result, these veterans developed the sense that they were betrayed by the political and military leadership. To borrow a term introduced by trauma scholars Smith and Freed, they perceived institutional betrayal entailing the violation of a relationship of reliance by an institution against one of its members. As Smith and Freed also argue, such violations are particularly traumatic when members depend on the institution for their safety and well-being, and when the trust in it to care for their lives. There we go. I think I just figured myself out, man. This one paper. I think I just figured out why I've been so pissed for so long. It's this. It's this, man. It's the whole thing. It's not just what I did and what I saw. It's the context. It's the political context. It's the inability for the politicians and even the military commanders to just come to grips with the fact that this reality is a reality. You guys deployed us. You guys had no foresight. You guys didn't know what the fuck you were doing. And we all felt it. And now we're back and we realize you still don't know what you're doing. You're still a disaster. It's still a clown show. And so since we were a part of it, we feel like this is a continuation of our service. And that's exactly how I feel. It's like I'm not out of it. So either I completely dissociate myself from it, or I do what I'm doing here, which I guess is a form of trauma recovery. I don't know. But it's definitely helping because I know that you're listening, and I know through the comments that you're appreciative of the fact that somebody's saying something. I'm no expert. I'm no journalist, but I'm just trying to do my best to shed light on things that need light shedding. Either way, I appreciate you guys, and I appreciate you tuning in to the end. So that wraps this video up. I'm sure there's going to be more to follow on these developments. So if you want to hear more on anything related to veteran health, wellness, and mindset, you're definitely going to have to like, subscribe, and ring that bell. Only because we know that Emperor Trudeau wants to clamp down on any bit of dissension in his ranks. And God knows the lengths he will go to try and silence all of us. So ringing that bell and hitting subscribe helps a lot to ensure the algorithm knows that you want to listen to this content. All right, that's it for me. Thanks for tuning in. And don't forget, train hard, fight easy. See you on the next one. Peace.